The generator cut out at 11 minutes past midnight, and that was the first sign that something was wrong. Elena Hartley did not jump at the sudden darkness. She simply reached under the counter, found the battery lamp by feel, and switched it on. Years of night shifts had trained her hands to move faster than her fear. The small clinic she ran sat at the edge of a farming settlement called Belmore, a cluster of stone houses and wheat fields pressed against a range of low hills. It was the kind of place people described as forgotten, and until that night, Elena had believed forgotten meant safe. She heard the trucks before she saw them. 3 engines, maybe 4, grinding up the gravel road that led into the village. Dogs began barking in every direction at once. Elena set down the bandage roll she had been folding and walked to the window. Headlights swept across the fields like search beams, and behind them came shapes on foot, dozens of them, moving with the loose, confident stride of men who expected no resistance. She counted without meaning to. It was an old habit, counting things in a crisis, because numbers gave her something to hold on to when everything else was uncertain. By the time the first truck stopped at the village gate, she had counted past 40. When the rest spilled out from the second and third vehicles, she reached 50 and stopped counting altogether, because the number no longer mattered. What mattered was that there was one door between her patients and the road, and she was the only person standing behind it. The clinic held 6 people that night. An elderly farmer named Walter Pruitt, recovering from a fall that had cracked 2 ribs. A young mother, Ivy Coleman, whose infant daughter had a fever that had only just broken. A traveling teacher named Grace Whitfield, resting after a bout of dehydration. And in the back room, sedated and wrapped in fresh dressings, a soldier named Daniel Cross, who had been brought in 2 days earlier with a leg wound that the regional hospital did not have the beds to treat. Elena had not asked why Daniel Cross was traveling alone through farmland with a bullet wound and a uniform stripped of its insignia. She had simply done what she always did. She had stopped the bleeding, cleaned the wound, and given him a bed. It was not her place to ask questions. It had never been her place, not in this life. But something in the calm, practiced way she had assessed his injury, checking for arterial damage before he had even finished explaining what happened, should have told anyone watching that Elena Hartley had done this kind of work before, in places far rougher than a quiet farming village. Nobody had been watching, though. To the people of Belmore, she was simply the quiet nurse who kept the clinic running, who spoke softly, who never raised her voice even when patients screamed in pain. She kept her sleeves down in the summer heat, and if anyone had ever looked closely at the faded marks on her forearms, they might have asked questions she was not ready to answer. Nobody had looked. Not until now, when it might already be too late to matter. The lamp flickered as she crossed the room and locked the front door, more out of habit than any real hope that a simple bolt would stop 50 armed men. She moved to the back room, where Grace Whitfield was already awake, sitting up on her cot, ears straining toward the noise outside. "Trucks," Grace whispered. "I heard trucks." "I heard them too," Elena said, keeping her voice level. "I need you to help me. Can you walk?" Grace nodded, though her face had gone pale. Elena helped her to her feet and guided her toward the storage room at the rear of the building, where the walls were thick stone, and there was a second door leading out to the animal pens. It was not a perfect hiding place, but it was better than nothing, and right now, better than nothing was the only kind of plan Elena had time to build. She checked on Walter next. The old farmer was struggling to rise from his cot, one hand pressed against his bandaged ribs. "Stay down," Elena told him gently. "Moving will only hurt you more, and I need you calm right now. Can you do that for me?" "What's happening out there, girl?" he asked, his voice rough with worry, rather than fear for himself. "I don't know yet," Elena admitted. It was the truth, and she had learned long ago that lies, even kind ones, tended to fall apart at the worst possible moment. "But I am not going to let anything happen to you, not while I'm standing." Ivy Coleman appeared in the doorway then, her daughter clutched against her chest, the baby's small fever-flushed face pressed into her shoulder. Ivy's eyes were wide, darting toward the window where the headlights still swept across the yard. "Are they coming for us?" Ivy asked. "Is this about the harvest payments? My husband said men had been asking questions in the market." Elena did not have an answer to that, and she did not waste time guessing. Whatever these men wanted, whether it was supplies, money, or something else entirely, the reasons mattered less right now than the fact that they were here, and there were 50 of them, and there was one door. She moved back through the clinic, checking each window, each lock, each possible point of entry, the way she had once checked a perimeter in a life she rarely spoke about anymore. The training had never fully left her, even years after she had traded a uniform for a nurse's coat. It simply waited, quiet and dormant, for a night exactly like this one. Outside, a voice rose above the idling engines, amplified through some kind of handheld speaker. The words were sharp, commanding, directed at the village rather than at the clinic specifically. Elena caught fragments through the thick stone walls. Something about compliance, something about resources, something about not wanting trouble if nobody gave them any. She recognized the tone immediately. It was the voice of a man who believed nobody in this village had the will or the means to resist him. A man who expected fear to do most of his work before a single shot was fired. He was not entirely wrong. Fear was already moving through Belmore like a current, visible in the dark windows where families huddled together, in the silence that had swallowed the barking dogs, in the way even the wind seemed to have gone still. But fear alone was not surrender, and Elena intended to make sure of that. She returned to the back room where Daniel Cross lay sedated, his chest rising and falling in slow, even breaths, unaware that the quiet farming village where he had been recovering was now surrounded by exactly the kind of danger he had been running from. Elena checked his pulse, checked his dressing, and made a decision that would have surprised every single person who had ever called her, nothing more than a gentle nurse with a soft voice and steady hands. She was not going to wait for these men to break down her door. She moved to the supply cabinet, the one that held medications most people never thought to associate with anything beyond healing: sedatives, anesthetics, compounds that, in the wrong hands, might have seemed dangerous, but in the right hands, applied with precision and purpose, could become something else entirely. She began pulling vials, syringes, and small glass ampules, laying them out on a metal tray, with the same careful focus she used when preparing for surgery. Grace appeared in the doorway again, watching with a mixture of confusion and dawning understanding. "Elena," she said slowly, "what are you doing?" Elena did not look up from the tray. "I'm making sure nobody in this building gets hurt tonight," she said, "but I need you to trust me, and I need you to stay quiet, no matter what you hear over the next few hours." Outside, the voice on the speaker fell silent, replaced by the crunch of boots on gravel, dozens of pairs, spreading out across the village in organized groups. Someone shouted an order. A dog yelped and went silent. A window shattered somewhere down the road, followed by a woman's cry, quickly muffled. Elena's hands did not shake as she filled the first syringe. She had spent years learning how to save lives under impossible pressure, in places where the wrong decision meant someone did not wake up the next morning. Tonight, that same steadiness would have to do something it had never quite done before. Tonight, it would have to become the only line of defense between 50 armed men and everyone she had sworn to protect. The first heavy knock landed on the clinic door only moments later, rattling the frame, and Elena Hartley, the quiet medic that nobody in Belmore had ever thought twice about, turned to face it without a single trace of the fear she had every right to feel. The knock came again, harder this time, followed by a man's voice demanding the door be opened in the name of whatever authority he believed he carried with him that night. Elena set the loaded tray on a side table within easy reach and crossed the room slowly, deliberately. Each step measured the way she measured everything in a crisis. She was not stalling out of fear. She was buying time, because time was the one resource she could still control, and every second she held on to gave her patients one more moment of safety behind her. She reached the door and rested her palm flat against the old wood, feeling it shudder faintly under another impatient blow from the other side. Beyond it waited 50 armed men who believed they had already won simply by arriving. They did not know about the sedatives lined up on her tray, or the years buried in her past, or the particular kind of calm that only comes from having faced worse and survived it. They were about to find out. Elena unlocked the door herself, before it could be forced, and stepped back into the shadow of the entryway. 2 men pushed inside first, rifles slung across their chests, flashlights slicing through the dark clinic. Behind them, more shapes gathered at the threshold, waiting for a signal that the building was secure. "Anyone else in here?" the taller of the 2 demanded, his light sweeping over the empty front room, the neat rows of shelves, the faint smell of antiseptic that clung to every surface. "Only patients," Elena said. keeping her voice soft, almost apologetic, the voice of a woman who wanted no trouble. An old man with broken ribs, a mother with a sick baby, nothing here worth your time. The man studied her for a moment, taking in her plain coat, her tied-back hair, the tray of supplies she had positioned near the counter, as though it were nothing more than the ordinary clutter of a working clinic. He did not recognize it for what it was. Few people would have. "Search the back," he told his companion, and the second man moved past Elena toward the hallway that led to the storage room and the recovery ward. This was the moment Elena had been waiting for. She lifted the tray as if to move it out of the way, and in the same motion, brushed close enough to the first man to press a small covered syringe against his forearm through the fabric of his sleeve. It was a motion so quick, so unremarkable, that he barely registered it as anything more than an accidental touch. He would not feel its effects for another minute or two, enough time for her to be somewhere else entirely. She followed the second man down the hallway, letting him lead the way toward the recovery ward, where Daniel Cross still lay sedated, and Grace Whitfield waited in the shadows behind the storage room's second door. Elena's heart beat steadily, not from calm exactly, but from the same discipline that had once carried her through far darker corridors than this one. "He's stable," she said quickly, stepping in front of the man before he reached the ward's doorway. "The soldier. Gunshot wound to the leg. I wouldn't get too close unless you want the infection that's setting in." It was a lie, but a useful one, delivered with the same clinical confidence she used when explaining a diagnosis to a frightened family. The man hesitated, his light flicking toward the bed where Daniel lay motionless, bandages visible beneath a thin blanket. Infection was not something armed men liked to walk toward, and Elena had learned long ago that fear of the unknown could be more effective than any weapon. While his attention wavered, she reached into her coat pocket for the second prepared syringe, this one filled with a fast-acting sedative, rather than the slower dose she had given the first man. She moved with the same unremarkable ease, a brush of contact near his shoulder as she reached past him, to adjust an IV line that did not actually need adjusting. He barely noticed. Soldiers trained for combat rarely trained to notice a nurse's hands. By the time he turned to question her further, his knees had already begun to weaken. He caught himself against the doorframe, confusion crossing his face, and Elena guided him down gently, easing his weight onto the floor, rather than letting him fall and alert anyone outside. Grace emerged from the storage room the moment it was safe, eyes wide, and together they dragged him into the shadows beside Daniel's bed. "You knew exactly what to do," Grace whispered, staring at Elena, as though seeing her for the first time. "How did you know what to do?" There was no time to answer that question properly, not with dozens of men still moving through Belmore, and not with the first man from the front room likely growing dizzy by now, wondering why the walls had begun to tilt. Elena only shook her head and pressed a finger to her lips, urging silence, before moving back toward the front of the clinic to finish what she had started. The truth, though, was one she had carried quietly for years. Long before Belmore, long before the clinic and its soft lamplight and gentle patients, Elena Hartley had served as a combat medic in a unit that trained its members not only to heal, but to survive in places where survival itself was never guaranteed. She had learned, in those years, that the body could be a battlefield in more ways than one, that a trained hand with the right knowledge could disable a threat as effectively as any weapon, without ever needing to raise one. When she left that life behind, she had believed she was leaving the danger behind with it. She had never imagined the two lives might collide again, here, in a village she had chosen precisely because it seemed too small and too quiet for anyone to notice. She found the first man from the front room slumped against the counter, his rifle fallen loosely from his shoulder, breathing slow and even, deeply unconscious. Elena crouched beside him, checked his pulse out of habit even now, and gently removed his weapon, setting it well out of reach. Two men down, though down was a temporary word. She had no illusions that either would stay quiet for long, and 48 more remained scattered through the village, some already forcing their way into homes, others standing guard near the trucks, watching the road for any sign of resistance that had not yet come. Outside, she could hear raised voices, the crash of something breaking, a child crying somewhere in the dark before being hushed by a frightened parent. Belmore was a village of farmers and teachers, and old men recovering from falls, not soldiers, and Elena understood with a clarity that hardened rather than frightened her, that if anyone was going to slow these men down tonight, it would have to be her. She moved back to the storage room, where Grace was watching over Daniel and the sedated stranger, with an expression caught somewhere between fear and fierce determination. Walter Pruitt had managed to sit up despite his cracked ribs, listening intently to every word. "I need you to help me," Elena told them both, keeping her voice low and steady. "Not with fighting, with watching. I need eyes on the hallway, and I need someone who can pull a curtain closed at exactly the right moment if I ask for it. Can you do that?" Grace nodded immediately. Walter, wincing against the pain in his ribs, nodded as well, refusing to be left out simply because his body had betrayed him. "What about the baby?" Ivy asked from the doorway, her daughter finally asleep against her shoulder, despite the chaos outside. "What do you need from me?" "Stay with her. Stay quiet. Stay exactly where you are," Elena said. "That is the most important job in this entire building tonight, and I trust you to do it better than anyone else could." Ivy managed a shaky breath and nodded, retreating deeper into the storage room where the walls were thickest, and the second exit remained a possibility if everything else failed. Elena returned her attention to the tray of supplies, replenishing what she had used, mentally cataloging what remained. She did not have enough sedative to disable 50 men, not even close, and she knew better than to believe brute repetition of the same trick would work twice against men who might soon grow suspicious of a quiet nurse moving too easily among them. She needed a different approach for what was coming next, something that used the clinic itself as a tool, rather than relying solely on her hands. She thought of the layout of the building, the narrow hallway that forced anyone entering the recovery ward into single file, the storage room with its second door leading out toward the animal pens, the small examination room near the back that had only one entrance, and a window too narrow for a grown man to climb through quickly. A building could be as much a weapon as any syringe, if the person moving through it understood its geometry better than the people trying to conquer it. Through the front window, she watched more men gathering near the well at the center of the village, their leader among them, a broad-shouldered figure in a dark jacket who carried himself with the unmistakable posture of someone used to being obeyed without question. His name, she would later learn, was Marcus Voss, though in that moment he was only a silhouette issuing commands, unaware that inside the small stone clinic at the edge of his newly claimed territory, 2 of his men already lay unconscious on the floor. Elena stepped back from the window before anyone could notice her watching. She had bought a small amount of time, disabled 2 threats, and protected her patients for now, but the night was far from finished, and 50 had only just become 48. The math, she understood with a grim kind of clarity, was going to take considerably longer to work in her favor. She turned to Grace and Walter, both watching her with the same question in their eyes, unspoken but obvious. "What now?" "Now," Elena said quietly, "we make sure the next ones who come through that door never get the chance to search this building properly." She began moving supplies again, this time not only sedatives but bandages soaked in antiseptic that stung sharply on contact with skin, alcohol swabs that could blind a man's eyes for several painful seconds if used correctly, and the heavy metal tray itself, which could serve a purpose far removed from carrying medicine if the moment called for it. She was not planning to fight 50 men with force. She was planning to make this building the last place any of them wanted to search twice. Footsteps approached again from outside, more than 2 sets this time, and Elena positioned herself near the doorway, tray in hand, expression arranged into the same soft, unthreatening calm that had fooled the first 2 men completely. Whatever came through that door next would find exactly what it expected to find, right up until the moment it did not. The door swung open, and 3 men stepped inside this time, rifles raised, flashlights cutting through the dim clinic with far more suspicion than before. One of them must have noticed something was wrong, because his light lingered too long on the empty space near the counter where his companion should have been standing guard. "Where are the 2 who came in first?" he demanded, voice sharp with the beginning of real alarm. Elena tilted her head, the picture of gentle confusion. "2 men? I only saw 1, and he went to check on my patients in the back. Perhaps he's still there." It was a thin excuse, and she knew it would not hold for more than a few seconds, but a few seconds was often all she needed. As the man took a step toward the hallway to investigate, Elena's hand moved once more, quick and precise, toward the tray beside her. What happened next would take barely a minute to unfold, but it would mark the true beginning of the fight that Elena Hartley, the quiet medic of Belmore, had never asked for, and had never once considered running from. The alcohol swab caught the suspicious man directly across both eyes, a sharp burning sting that made him cry out and stagger backward, hands flying to his face. His two companions turned toward the sound, momentarily distracted, and in that half-second of confusion, Elena swept the heavy metal tray upward, catching the nearest rifle barrel and forcing it toward the ceiling. The weapon discharged into the wooden beams above, deafening in the small room, plaster and splinters raining down across the counter. The noise was a risk she had calculated and accepted. Silence had already become impossible the moment three armed men decided to search her clinic with real suspicion. What mattered now was speed, not stealth. Elena drove her elbow hard into the ribs of the man whose rifle she had deflected, using the same anatomical precision she used to locate a vein or set a fracture, striking exactly where the impact would do the most to disable, rather than simply hurt. He folded forward with a grunt, and Elena used the opening to press the third prepared syringe against his neck, the sedative working faster this close to a major vein. The third man, still blinded and cursing, swung his rifle blindly in her direction. Elena ducked low, using the counter as cover, and grabbed a heavy glass bottle of antiseptic from the shelf, hurling it toward the sound of his voice. It struck him across the shoulder, not enough to seriously injure him, but enough to send him stumbling into a shelf of supplies, which collapsed loudly around him, tangling him in fallen boxes and scattered bandages. Grace appeared in the hallway doorway, face pale but resolute, holding a length of gauze bandage stretched tight between her hands, the way Elena had shown her only minutes earlier. As the blinded man staggered toward the sound of the commotion, Grace looped the bandage around his ankles from behind, pulling hard enough to send him crashing face first onto the floor, where he lay groaning, disoriented, and thoroughly entangled. "That's 4, Walter Pruitt called weakly from the recovery ward doorway, one hand still pressed to his ribs, the other gripping the frame for support. He had refused to stay hidden entirely, insisting on watching the hallway as Elena had asked, and there was something fierce and proud in his voice despite the pain etched across his face. Elena did not allow herself to celebrate the small victory. 4 men down out of 50, left 46 others somewhere in the darkness outside, and the gunshot that had torn through the ceiling would not go unnoticed for long. She moved quickly now, dragging the sedated men into the storage room alongside the first 2, stripping them of weapons and radios, anything that might be used against her or, just as importantly, anything that might allow their allies outside to hear what had happened inside the clinic. One of the radios crackled to life in her hand as she lifted it, a voice on the other end asking for a status update from the clinic team. Elena's mind worked quickly, drawing on instincts she had not used in years but had never truly lost. She keyed the radio and, altering her voice into something rougher, more clipped, mimicking the tone she had heard from the men themselves, responded that the building was secure, no threats found, continuing the search. There was a pause on the other end, then an acknowledgement, and the radio fell silent again. It would not buy indefinite time. Someone would eventually notice the prolonged silence, the missing men, the gunshot that had gone unexplained. But every minute Elena bought was another minute her patients remained breathing, another minute closer to whatever dawn might bring in the way of outside help. She turned to find Grace staring at her, breathing hard, hands still trembling from the adrenaline of what she had just done. "I didn't know I could do that," Grace said, almost to herself. "I've never hurt anyone in my life." "You didn't hurt anyone tonight," Elena said gently, checking the fallen man's pulse out of the same ingrained habit that governed everything she did. "You protected people. There's a difference, and it matters." There was no time to dwell on the distinction further. Through the shattered front window, Elena could see more movement in the village beyond, torches and flashlights converging near the well, where Marcus Voss had been giving orders earlier. Whatever plan he had for Belmore, it clearly involved more than simply passing through, and Elena suspected, with a cold certainty settling in her stomach, that the real test of the night had not yet begun. She checked on Daniel Cross once more, relieved to find his vital signs still steady, despite the chaos unfolding around his sickbed. If Marcus Voss and his men were searching for something specific in this village, and Elena was beginning to suspect that a wounded, unnamed soldier hiding in a rural clinic might be exactly the kind of prize such men would want, then protecting Daniel had just become as urgent as protecting anyone else under her care. A new sound reached her ears then, Heavier footsteps. More of them this time, moving with purpose toward the clinic rather than simply passing by. Elena's pulse quickened, though her hands remained steady as she reloaded her small arsenal of syringes, calculating doses, calculating distances, calculating exactly how many more men she could realistically disable before her limited supplies ran out entirely. "Grace, I need you to take Walter and Ivy and the baby through the storage room and out to the animal pens," Elena said quickly. "There's a gap in the fence near the old grain shed. Wait there, stay low, and do not come back inside no matter what you hear." "What about you?" Grace asked, already moving to gather the others despite the fear plain on her face. "I'm staying with Daniel," Elena said. "He can't move on his own, and I'm not leaving him here alone." Grace hesitated only a moment before nodding and hurrying to help Walter to his feet, guiding him gently toward the storage room, where Ivy waited with her sleeping daughter, still miraculously undisturbed by the violence unfolding just rooms away. Elena watched them disappear through the second door, felt a small measure of relief settle into her chest, and then turned back toward the hallway just as the front door of the clinic burst open once more. This time, 6 men entered at once, weapons raised, flashlights sweeping with far more urgency than before. At the front of the group stood a man Elena recognized instantly from the silhouette she had seen near the well earlier that night. Marcus Voss stepped into the clinic himself, his expression cold and assessing as his light found the scattered supplies, the collapsed shelf, the unmistakable signs of a struggle. "Where are my men?" he said, not as a question but as a demand, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone accustomed to immediate answers. Elena stepped forward from the hallway, positioning herself between the armed group and the doorway leading to Daniel's bed, her hands empty and raised slightly, the picture of a frightened medic caught in an impossible situation. It was, in part, exactly what she was. Fear had not left her. She had simply learned, long ago, how to work alongside it, rather than let it work against her. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, keeping her voice unsteady, letting a tremor slip into it that was not entirely manufactured. "Men came through here searching the clinic. I have sick patients. I haven't done anything." Marcus Voss studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as they moved from her face to the scattered debris around the room, lingering on the shelf that had collapsed, the shattered glass, the ceiling still smoking faintly from the earlier gunshot. Something in the scene did not add up to the simple story of a frightened nurse, and Elena could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. "Search her," he said finally, gesturing to 2 of the men beside him, "and search the building. Every room." Rough hands seized Elena's arms before she could react, pulling them behind her back with enough force to make her gasp. She did not fight the restraint, understanding immediately that resistance now would only confirm every suspicion Voss already carried. Instead, she let herself be held, her mind working furiously beneath the calm mask she kept fixed on her face, searching for the next opening, the next moment where the balance of the room might shift back in her favor. 2 men moved past her toward the hallway, toward the recovery ward where Daniel Cross lay defenseless and sedated, and Elena felt something cold and sharp cut through her carefully maintained composure. This was the moment she had feared since the trucks first appeared on the gravel road, the moment where her careful maneuvering might not be enough, where the people she had sworn to protect stood only seconds away from discovery. She needed a distraction, something powerful enough to pull every eye in the room away from that hallway, and she needed it immediately. With her arms pinned behind her back, and Marcus Voss watching her with the patient, dangerous attention of a man who had already begun to suspect that this quiet clinic held far more than it appeared to. Elena's eyes flicked toward the fallen medical tray near the counter, then toward the cabinet behind it, where a row of oxygen tanks stood ready for patients in respiratory distress. An idea formed quickly, born from years of understanding exactly how volatile certain combinations in a medical setting could become, if pushed to their limits, and exactly how much confusion a sudden burst of noise and smoke could create in a room full of men already on edge. "Wait," she said suddenly, her voice sharpening with what sounded like genuine alarm rather than fear. "There's a gas leak from the earlier gunshot. It hit the oxygen line. You need to get everyone out of here before it—" She did not need to finish the sentence. The mention of gas and the visible cloud of dust still hanging in the air near the damaged ceiling was enough to send a ripple of unease through the men gathered in the small room. Marcus Voss's eyes flicked upward toward the ceiling, toward the faint haze still drifting from the earlier gunfire, and for just a moment, his attention wavered from Elena entirely. It was all the opening she needed. Elena dropped her weight suddenly, twisting hard against the grip of the man holding her right arm, a technique she had learned and practiced so many years ago that her muscles remembered it, even when her mind was racing too fast to consciously recall the steps. The sudden shift caught him off guard, his hold loosening just enough for her to wrench free, and she used the momentum to drive her shoulder into his chest, sending him stumbling backward into a shelf of supplies. The second man holding her arm reacted a half-second too late, and Elena spun toward him, using the same elbow strike that had disabled the man near the counter earlier that night, catching him square beneath the ribs. He doubled over with a sharp exhale, and Elena did not hesitate, snatching a syringe from her coat pocket and pressing it into his shoulder before he could recover his balance. Marcus Voss shouted an order, and the room erupted into motion, men lunging toward her from every direction. Elena grabbed the fallen metal tray from the floor and swept it in a wide arc, forcing back the nearest attacker, buying herself half a second to retreat toward the hallway, where Daniel Cross still lay defenseless. She could not win this through force alone, not against 6 men in an enclosed room, and she knew it with the same clear-eyed honesty that had guided every decision she had made that night. What she could do was control where the fight happened, and she had spent the last several hours learning every inch of this building's layout with exactly this possibility in mind. She backed into the narrow hallway, forcing her pursuers to follow single file rather than as a group, the same tactic that had worked earlier, now deployed with greater urgency. The first man to round the corner met a shelf of glass bottles that Elena had deliberately left balanced near the doorway, sending them crashing down around his feet, sharp fragments and spilled antiseptic turning the floor treacherous beneath him. She retreated further, into the recovery ward itself, positioning herself between the door and Daniel's bed, tray raised like a shield. Marcus Voss appeared in the doorway a moment later, having pushed past his stumbling men, his expression no longer merely suspicious but openly furious, the look of a man who had badly underestimated the person standing in front of him. "You've caused a great deal of trouble for one quiet nurse," he said, his voice low and controlled despite the chaos behind him. "I'm not finished yet," Elena replied, and for the first time that night, there was no tremor in her voice at all, no careful performance of fear, only the flat, steady certainty of someone who had already decided exactly how far she was willing to go. Voss stepped further into the room, and Elena saw the moment he registered Daniel Cross lying in the bed behind her, recognition flickering across his face. Whatever business had brought 50 armed men to Belmore that night, it clearly involved the wounded soldier she had sworn to protect, and Elena understood now, with total clarity, exactly what she was fighting to prevent. "Step aside," Voss said. "This does not need to become anything worse than it already has." "It already became worse the moment your men walked through that door," Elena said. "I'm not moving." He gestured to the 2 men, still capable of standing behind him, and they advanced together, more cautious now, wary of the tray in her hands, and the unpredictable resourcefulness she had already demonstrated twice that night. Elena backed toward the narrow window at the far side of the room, buying herself another few seconds, her mind racing through the dwindling supplies left in her coat pocket, calculating exactly how many more moves she had left before the numbers finally caught up with her. She had 1 syringe remaining, filled with a stronger sedative, reserved for the most severe cases, enough to disable a grown man within seconds rather than minutes. It was meant for emergencies, for moments when nothing else would work quickly enough. This, she decided, qualified. As the nearest man lunged toward her, Elena sidestepped with the same trained economy of motion that had carried her through the entire night, using his own momentum to redirect him into the wall beside the bed. In the half-second of confusion that followed, she pressed the final syringe into his neck, and within moments his knees buckled beneath him. That left Voss and 1 remaining man standing between her and the door, and Elena's supplies had finally run dry. Whatever came next would have to be fought with nothing but the tray in her hands, and the sheer stubborn will that had carried her this far. The remaining man rushed her, and Elena swung the tray hard into his temple, a blow that staggered rather than felled him, but bought her the half-second she needed to grab a fallen chair and drive it into his chest, sending him crashing backward through the doorway into the hall, where he collided with the shelf of broken glass bottles and did not immediately rise again. That left only Marcus Voss. He did not rush her the way his men had. He simply stood in the doorway, studying her with an expression that had shifted from anger into something closer to grim respect, the look of a man reassessing an opponent he had badly misjudged. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. "Really?" "Someone who is not going to let you touch this patient, or anyone else in this village," Elena said. "That's all you need to know." He took a step forward, and Elena raised the tray again, though she could feel the exhaustion beginning to pull at her arms, the accumulated strain of hours spent fighting with precision rather than raw strength. She had disabled or delayed 9 of his men now, but she had also used nearly everything she carried, and the man standing in front of her was larger, stronger, and clearly far more dangerous than any of the others she had faced that night. What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds that felt, to Elena, like they stretched far longer. Voss lunged, and Elena twisted aside, but not quickly enough to avoid his hand closing around her wrist, wrenching the tray from her grip and sending it clattering across the floor. He was strong, far stronger than she was, and for the first time that night, Elena felt the true weight of the danger she was facing settle fully upon her. She drove her knee upward, catching him off guard, and used the moment of released pressure to grab the only weapon left within reach, a heavy oxygen regulator sitting on the bedside table beside Daniel Cross. She swung it hard, catching Voss across the shoulder, and he staggered back with a sharp grunt of pain, more surprised than seriously hurt, but enough to buy her another precious moment. Outside, faint but growing steadily louder, Elena caught the sound of new engines approaching along the gravel road, different from the trucks that had arrived hours earlier, a rhythm and pitch that suggested something larger, something organized. She did not have time to wonder what it meant. Voss recovered quickly, lunging at her again, and Elena barely managed to sidestep, putting the hospital bed between them as a barrier, Daniel still sedated and unaware just inches away from the struggle unfolding above him. "You cannot hold out forever," Voss said, breathing hard now, his earlier confidence replaced by something more desperate. "There are still men outside this building. Even if you win this fight, you cannot win the whole village." "I don't need to win the whole village," Elena said, matching his ragged breathing with her own. "I only need to hold this room until help arrives, and from the sound of those engines, I don't think I'll need to hold it much longer." Voss's eyes flicked toward the window, toward the growing sound of approaching vehicles, and for the first time that night, real uncertainty crossed his face. Whatever plan had brought him and his men to Belmore, it had clearly not accounted for reinforcements arriving before he could finish what he started, and Elena watched him make a rapid calculation of his own, weighing the cost of continuing this fight against the growing risk of being caught here when whoever was approaching finally arrived. He made his decision quickly, lunging one final time, not toward Elena but toward Daniel's bed, perhaps hoping to use the wounded soldier as leverage against her. Elena anticipated the move a half-second before he made it, throwing herself between Voss and the bed, absorbing the impact of his shoulder against her own, with a sharp gasp of pain that she refused to let slow her down. She grabbed his arm as he tried to push past her, twisting it behind his back with the same trained precision that had carried her through the entire night, forcing him down onto his knees beside the bed. He struggled against her hold, but Elena pressed her weight down with the last reserves of strength she had left, holding him in place even as her arms trembled with exhaustion and the sharp ache of the impact she had just taken. The engines outside grew louder still, followed by shouted commands in the darkness, voices that did not belong to Marcus Voss's remaining men. Elena held her position, arm locked against Voss's shoulder, refusing to release him, even as the sounds of a much larger confrontation began to unfold outside the clinic walls, until finally, footsteps pounded up to the shattered front door, and unfamiliar voices called out, asking if anyone inside needed help. "In here," Elena called back, her voice hoarse but steady. "I have him. I need someone to secure this man immediately." 2 uniformed figures appeared in the doorway moments later, weapons raised, but lowering slightly at the sight of a lone nurse, bruised and exhausted, holding a much larger man pinned against the floor with nothing but sheer determination, and a hold she refused to release. They moved quickly to take Voss into custody, and only then did Elena finally allow her grip to loosen, sinking back onto her heels, as the adrenaline that had carried her through the entire night began, at last, to fade. Dawn arrived over Belmore with a pale gray light that revealed, slowly and painfully, the full scope of what had happened during the night. The convoy that had arrived just in time turned out to be a regional security patrol that had been tracking Marcus Voss and his group for weeks, alerted finally by a farmer from a neighboring settlement who had slipped away in the chaos to raise the alarm. They arrived to find a village shaken but largely intact, and a small stone clinic at its edge that told a story none of them could quite believe until they saw it with their own eyes. 9 men lay inside, some still sedated, others bound and disoriented, all of them defeated not by a squad of trained soldiers but by a single nurse who had used nothing more than her medical knowledge, the layout of her own clinic, and a composure that refused to break even when 50 armed men had surrounded her patients. Marcus Voss himself sat against the wall of the recovery ward, hands secured, his expression a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect as he watched Elena finally allow herself to sit down, exhaustion settling over her like a heavy blanket, now that the danger had finally passed. The patrol commander, a steady woman named Sophie Lindquist, moved through the clinic assessing the scene, taking note of the careful precision behind everything Elena had done, from the positioning of the sedated men to the makeshift barricade that had funneled attackers into a hallway one at a time. She crouched beside Elena, studying her with open curiosity. "Where did you learn to do all this?" Sophie asked. Elena managed a tired, small smile. "A long time ago, in a life I don't talk about very often," she said. "I was a combat medic before I became a village nurse. I thought I had left all of it behind me." "It seems it never really left you," Sophie said, and there was no accusation in her tone, only genuine admiration. Outside, the remaining members of Voss's group, the ones who had not made it into the clinic and had instead spent the night attempting to secure the rest of the village, were being rounded up one by one as the patrol swept through Belmore's narrow streets. Many surrendered without resistance the moment they saw reinforcements arriving, their earlier confidence evaporating entirely now that the numbers no longer favored them. By mid-morning, the last of them had been detained, and the village that had spent the night in terrified silence slowly began to emerge from behind locked doors and shuttered windows. Grace Whitfield returned from the animal pens first, leading Walter Pruitt and Ivy Coleman, whose daughter had slept through most of the ordeal despite everything happening around her. Grace ran the last few steps toward the clinic, embracing Elena tightly the moment she reached her, tears finally spilling free now that the danger had passed, and there was room, at last, for feeling everything she had been holding back all night. "You saved us," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "All of us. I still don't understand how, but you did." Elena returned the embrace, feeling the accumulated exhaustion of the night pressing down on her shoulders, but also something else, something lighter, a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing every person she had promised to protect had made it through until morning. "We saved each other," she corrected gently. "I couldn't have done any of it without you helping me." Walter Pruitt approached more slowly, one hand still braced against his ribs, but there was a fierce pride in his weathered face as he studied the young woman who had spent the night defending a clinic full of strangers with nothing but medical supplies and sheer determination. "I've lived in this village my whole life," he said. "Never seen anything like what you did last night. Never even imagined it was possible." Inside the recovery ward, Daniel Cross had finally begun to stir, the sedation wearing off slowly as morning light filtered through the narrow window. He blinked awake to find Elena checking his vital signs with the same steady, practiced hands she had used throughout the night, though now there was a visible weariness in her movements that had not been there when she first treated his wound days earlier. "What happened?" he asked groggily, taking in the bandaged strangers scattered around the room, the broken shelf, the bullet holes still visible in the ceiling. "A great deal, while you were sleeping," Elena said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite everything. "You're safe now. That's what matters." Daniel studied her more closely, taking in the fresh bruise forming along her jaw, the exhaustion etched into every line of her face, and something in his expression shifted, an unspoken understanding passing between two people who recognized in each other the particular kind of resolve that only comes from having faced real danger and refused to look away from it. "You did all this," he said slowly, "didn't you? Not just tonight, but before. You were one of us once." Elena did not answer immediately. adjusting his dressing with careful attention rather than meeting his eyes. But eventually, she nodded. A small, simple acknowledgement of a past she had spent years keeping quiet. A past that no longer felt like something to hide, now that it had helped her protect an entire village through the longest night of her life. By afternoon, word of what had happened at the Belmore Clinic had spread far beyond the village itself, carried by the security patrol back to the regional headquarters, and from there, outward in the way that remarkable stories tend to travel, gathering detail and wonder with every retelling. A quiet nurse, working alone in a forgotten farming village, had faced down 50 armed men, and emerged not only alive but victorious, without a single patient under her care coming to serious harm. Sophie Lindquist filed her official report that evening, though she found herself struggling to capture in formal language the full scope of what she had witnessed that morning, the careful precision behind every decision Elena had made, the way an entire clinic had been transformed into a fortress through nothing more than knowledge, patience, and an unshakable commitment to the people inside it. In the end, she simply wrote that Elena Hartley's actions had prevented what could have been a devastating tragedy for the entire settlement, and that her conduct throughout the incident represented an extraordinary example of courage under pressure. The following days brought a stream of visitors to Belmore, officials wanting statements, journalists hoping for interviews, curious neighbors from surrounding villages, eager to see for themselves the clinic where such an impossible story had unfolded. Elena found the attention uncomfortable in ways the danger itself had never been, far more at ease treating a wound or calming a frightened patient than standing before strangers asked to explain how she had done what she did. "I only did what needed to be done," she told one reporter, when pressed for the third time about her thoughts during the confrontation. "Anyone with the right training would have done the same in my position." It was, perhaps, too modest an answer, and everyone who had witnessed the aftermath in Belmore knew it. Grace Whitfield, in particular, made a point of correcting the narrative whenever she had the chance, telling anyone who would listen that Elena's calm had never wavered, not once, through hours of danger that would have broken far more experienced people. Walter Pruitt told the story to every visitor who passed through the village for months afterward, embellishing certain details with each retelling, but never once exaggerating the core truth at its heart, that a quiet medic had stood alone against overwhelming odds and refused to yield an inch of ground. Daniel Cross recovered fully over the following weeks, his leg healing under Elena's continued care, and before he left Belmore to return to whatever life awaited him beyond the village, he sought her out one final time, finding her in the clinic garden tending to a small patch of herbs she used in her treatments. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said, "not just for treating my wound, but for everything after. I know what you did that night wasn't easy, and I know it wasn't something you were required to do." Elena straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, and offered him the same steady smile that had somehow, despite everything, never fully left her throughout the entire ordeal. "I became a nurse because I wanted to protect people," she said. "That night just asked more of me than most nights do, but the answer was always going to be yes." Marcus Voss, along with the surviving members of his group, was transferred to regional custody within days of the incident. His plans for Belmore, and whatever resources or leverage he had hoped to seize from the village, permanently disrupted by a single determined woman who had refused to let fear dictate her actions. In the months that followed, Belmore itself became something of a quiet legend in the surrounding region, not for the danger it had faced, but for the extraordinary way that danger had been met and overcome. Elena Hartley returned, eventually, to the rhythm of ordinary clinic life, treating broken bones and seasonal fevers, delivering babies, and comforting the elderly through their final years, the same work she had always done, with the same quiet dedication she had always brought to it. But something had shifted in the way the village looked at her now, a recognition that had not existed before that long, dangerous night. She was no longer simply the soft-spoken nurse people took for granted, easy to overlook amid the daily business of farming and family life. She had become, in the eyes of everyone who had witnessed it, proof of something the people of Belmore would carry with them for the rest of their lives, a reminder that courage rarely announces itself in advance, that the quietest people in any room are sometimes carrying more strength than anyone around them could ever guess, and that on the worst night of their lives, it had not been a soldier or a guard who stood between them and disaster, but a medic who had simply refused to let anyone she cared for come to harm. Years later, When new families settled in Belmore and asked about the old clinic at the edge of the village, the story they were told had grown into something close to folklore, though every detail at its heart remained exactly as true as the night it happened. They were told about a quiet nurse who had once faced 50 armed men entirely alone, and who had walked away having protected every single person under her care, proving, in the space of a single unforgettable night, that nobody should ever be underestimated, simply because they choose to carry their strength quietly.